There's one thing I know. Money breeds money.
Robbery is a 1967 crime thriller directed by Peter Yates.
It's based on the true-life Great Train Robbery in 1963, where a gang of thieves stole, I think it was over £2 million from a Glasgow to London Royal Mail train. Yes, based very closely on that case. Stanley Baker plays Paul Clifton. It's a career criminal who's planning his sort of biggest, most audacious heist yet of this train. Film follows sort of the meticulous planning and execution of that heist, along with the pursuit of these crims by a sort of dogged, determined detective played by James Booth. Apart from the actual robbery itself, doesn't really follow the real story too closely.
Well, so it's based on a book, which is based on the actual events, but to keep themselves out of legal waters, essentially the train robbery is based on court evidence, but then everything around it is all made up, it's all fictitious.
Yeah.
For this film. So I'd never seen this before, but a few months ago, the BBC, I think, did... Well, I watched it a few months ago, I don't know when it was made.
It was 10 years ago. If it's the one I'm thinking of.
With Jim Broadbent.
Yeah.
Okay, I watched it on BritBox, so I just watched it recently. Anyway, so 10 years ago. But that was 2 parts, and they did it kind of, following both, similar to what the film does, actually.
Yeah.
In fact, watching it, I think they took quite a few nods from the film, but it follows both the criminals themselves and the police. But I think that one is a bit more, because times have changed. I mean, this is very close to when it actually happened.
Yeah.
Now we're 40, 50 years on from the actual incident, so you can probably get away with telling a more truer story of what actually happened, as opposed to making bits up here and there.
At the time, there was, as soon as it happened, it was huge news because it was like the biggest heist ever.
Biggest one ever, yeah.
These days, £3 million. I don't know, might pay your energy bill for a few months and buy a few bit of shopping, but it won't get you very far. I wouldn't say no, but...
I would say no, because it's against the law, Simon.
Oh, well, of course. How silly of me. Anyway, it was big news because it was such a huge amount of money. Immediately, movie studios wanted to dramatise it. The real people involved, a lot of them were caught quite quickly. Obviously legal proceedings were still going on, and, they didn't want to be portrayed in a negative light, even though they were criminals. So it was very difficult to get anything made. I think there was a German film made in 1966, so the year before this, which had German actors who were then dubbed with English voices. But again, I don't think they didn't use the real names or anything. I don't think it was until Buster, the Phil Collins film, which is about one of the robbers whose nickname was Buster, that they actually used started to use the real names of those involved. Probably the most famous person involved was Ronnie Biggs, who I remember I'd sort of forgotten about him until I started reading about this film. I was like, of course, because he was on the news all the time because he he legged it. Yeah. And he lived in Australia, and then he moved to Brazil, and there was no extradition treaty. They basically couldn't bring him home.
Wound up on the great rock and roll swindle by the Sex Pistols. Did a song on that.
So, he lived it up in Brazil until eventually he came home in sort of the early, I think 2001. Yeah, and then they locked him up. I think he was released after about, a few years, because he was in poor health, but he still managed to live another 4 years. So, he died in his 80s, so he didn't do too bad. I think he said that he regretted what he'd done and said he wasted his life because he couldn't, even in Brazil, because he was a felon, that put certain restrictions on him. Even though the UK couldn't extradite him, he still put certain restrictions on him within Brazil.
You're having to live your life with looking over your shoulder pretty much.
Exactly,
you don't get to live your normal life.
No, I mean, this is the thing about this film. It's something like Buster. It kind of almost glamorises that sort of life, particularly as it is a kind of comedy. Isn't he a funny guy? Crim trying to rob people, hilarious. But in reality, they're stealing from people in the real robbery. They didn't kill anybody, but they did bash the train driver over the head, and he never really recovered properly.
No, he did die some years later.
I mean, it was unrelated, but he never really recovered from that head injury.
I think that's the trouble with a lot of these films. They do portray them as, especially older films, they portray them in this kind of almost like James Bond villains. They're not horrible people, but they've done something a little bit naughty, and they often show them kind of, it looks exciting. I mean, even this film, makes it kind of look exciting.
I mean, it may be a little bit, but I would say more realistic.
Absolutely.
Than something like Buster.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. Yeah. But there is that kind of, because it's there's a big train in here, and then there's this, we'll talk about, there's a car chase in there and things like that, which obviously, it makes the films quite exciting. But yes, in reality, these people were horrendous people. And Britain is famous for its crime thriller. There are tons and tons of crime films, some based on fact and some based on fiction. We obviously have, the craze, London in the 1960s was kind of rife with, criminal underworld and gangs and the craze and these guys and lots of other ones. They weren't to be messed with, you know. There was a kind of glamorous side to them because a lot of them used to hang out at clubs, or they owned clubs, should I say, and then so they had that kind of nightlife. And also what was mixed in with that was a lot of acting as well. I was reading the other day about something that a lot of actors ended up hanging out with these gangsters. Simply because the actors, when they finished shooting, they would finish shooting after the pubs closed, but they were able to go to these clubs. So a lot of them started hanging out with gangs. So the gang life kind of took on this glamorous edge, simply, I think, because of people they were hanging out with at the time. But in reality, they weren't nice people, and what they did was wrong, and and a lot of them ended up inside paying for it, which is obviously what happens when you steal these big, large lumps of money and do these, criminal underworld dealings. But the film itself, I really enjoyed. I hadn't seen it before, actually. It kind of starts up with, again, which is, I think, fictitious. They're stealing some diamonds. And the way they do that is by, they set a kind of a gas bomb inside this car. And the guy goes into the jeweller's and gets his suitcase, which is, tied to him. And they chase him down. The gas bomb goes off. And then this fake ambulance comes in, picks him up, takes him off, and then they get the jewels. And then straight away, you are into a car chase. Which is such... we've spoken about, obviously, from countries like America are so famous for doing car chases in their films. Britain, not so much, and perhaps it's the nature of our roads or the cars or whatever. But this is some exciting driving going on throughout London in 1967. I was quite blown away by it.
It all looks real. It doesn't, because obviously a lot of films at that time, they would have rear projection, and it would just be someone sat in the studio doing the motions, but they weren't actually going anywhere. It was just footage behind them. James Bond, particularly, a lot of the early James Bond films, rife with that. Which is fine. Obviously you don't want to put the actors in danger. But this film, it looks. The actors are right there.
They're right there.
You can see the background flying past the window. Obviously some of the external shots, I'm assuming it was stunt drivers. Crazy stuff. And there's a bit where a policeman stood in the road with his baton. And he hits the windscreen as they're driving towards him.
Chucks the baton, and the whole thing just got shatters.
I was watching it, and obviously it was caught up in the chase. I was like, hold on, did that just happened in camera? And that, and
then they just break out the window and carry on driving.
He just whacked the windscreen for real as they were driving along. So I had to rewind it and watch it again. I was like, what? What just happened?
It literally comes at the beginning of the movie. There's not much has happened, and then it just takes off literally. And it's so exciting. Like I say, these are the things that make this kind of life look exciting, but maybe not, because that's kind of some dangerous driving. But it was very impressive, very very well done.
I think I would say a lot of the, again, like the rear projection, a lot of the time they would speed up footage. Again, that occurs a few times in the early Bond films. But again, none of that here. They're all, they're absolutely herring down the road.
Pelting it down the road.
And it's all, you could say, it's all for real. Yeah, crazy stuff. And it was sort of in the days before there was sort of official permission required.
They just kind of go out
let's just go out and do it. And I think obviously they didn't just go and do it, but the police were aware. But I think they were kind of like, oh, we'll just the other way while you're filming, don't worry about it. So as long as no one was hurt, then that was fine. But I presume they closed roads. I don't know, but it was in the days before you had to kind of get official permission. And there's all sorts of famous London landmarks. They go down Oxford Street and all sorts of stuff. So obviously the traffic wasn't like it is now.
No,
but and the number of people probably less as well. But still, a busy, built-up city, and they're absolutely herring down the road.
And there is the classic, without obviously giving too much away, there's the classic, children walking across the road, and they come at them. It's obviously it's all cut together cleverly, and the children weren't actually there, but the way they do it, it's a very exciting scene, and I think that really kind of sets. But it also sets up the film to show you that these men will stop at nothing to get away. You know, they want what they've got, and they don't care who they run down to get their prize, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it puts the police in a good light as well, right from the start of the film. Again, a lot of the time in these films, the police are sort of portrayed as maybe a little bit incompetent or just, you know, played for comedy. Yeah. Whereas in this, you know, they are on the case. They know they're on these criminals the whole film, and they know they're planning something. You know, in this chase, as soon as they ditch the ambulance, the cops see them and they're on them. You know, and they're behind them the whole time. To the point where you think, well, how are they going to get away? Because they're behind them so close. The police are portrayed as able to do their job for a change, which, you know, sometimes in these films is the opposite. Really? But then I think maybe that makes the rest of the film not quite as exciting. It's like it starts with such a high. When my adrenaline was up, and I thought kind of. But then you're waiting for to go
robbery, into the robbery,
which you know doesn't occur till sort of halfway through the film.
No, and also because that is, I mean, obviously trains go fast, but they slow the train. If you know the crime, so essentially what they rob the Royal Mail or GPO train that coming down from Glasgow. They found a spot on the railway, and their plan was to stop the train, and they actually got someone in to change the signal because it was a green-red signal, and they were able to. I think they covered up the green one, and then the red one is on, so it essentially stops the train. A little further down or back down the track is a bridge, and they're all waiting there for them, and they got people up here, but they've stopped it, and then they send them onto the train itself, take the train driver hostage. They had their own train driver that was a train driver. This I'm taking a lot of this from the drama that I watched, and I have read bits. They don't explain all of this in this film. He was unable to get the train going, so then they knocked out the driver, but they put him back in and got him to do it. They uncoupled the train, which had the post van on it, and then they took that down to this bridge where they were able to unload all the money. It's gripping, but it's not as high speed as the chase at the beginning. But it's still gripping because you know it's a well shot film, and it's well put together. And there are moments in there which are a little bit Nile-based. There's a really great shot actually after the robbery, which did put me on my edge of my seat. So they're kind of, you know, holed up in. It's actually different in the drama series. They in a farm.
Yeah, that's what they did in real life.
I think that's what they did in real life. Yeah, they send in a helicopter to try and hunt them down. And there's a couple of shots in there which were, I thought, pretty exciting. It's like, you know, are they going to catch them out? Are they not going to catch them out? And I thought that was a couple of things there were shot really, you know, really interestingly. You know, obviously just to go back to that exciting car chase at the beginning. You know, we did The Hunted last week because obviously William Friedkin, you know, famous for French Connection. One of his drivers had worked on Bullitt, and that's basically where this Bullitt came. So Peter Yates, who directed this film, directed Bullitt, and it was this film. And I didn't realise this actually. I've watched Bullitt so many times over the years. One of my mum's favourite films. She used to show it as, you know, when we were probably way too young to really get it. And I didn't realise it was Steve McQueen saw this film, and he was like, I got to have him for it.
Oh right.
Because I don't think this film, so Robbery wasn't a huge success in America. I think it did quite well over here.
I think it did. It wasn't reviewed particularly well here, but it did well in the cinema.
Well.
And the opposite in America, it reviewed well, but didn't do wasn't very successful.
Okay,
so.
all right. But Steve McQueen had seen it, and he said, that's the person I want to do Bullitt. Not just because of the chase. I think obviously the chase is extremely exciting here, but also the kind of the methodical way that you know that they set up their crime, and the police set up as well. And there was a lot of that in Bullitt. I mean, in Bullitt, the chase comes a lot later in the film. I mean, if you watch the chase, the famous chase in Bullitt, and you watch the chase here, you're like, yeah, it's the same guy basically, because it's as exciting. They do that similar thing as I spoke about last week that Friedkin does, is that, you know, there's no music.
No, it's
just silent. Well, it's not silent because you hear the cars screeching around and cars crashing into each other and things like that. But it's you know, you don't need that music to drive it along. You've got the pun not intended. You can absolutely see why, you know, Steve McQueen, you know, wanted Peter Yates for that. I mean, Peter Yates went on. He's had, you know, we did Krull, which he did.
Yep.
I think his later films not as successful. I couldn't say all the films he's done,
I mean, The Deep, I think he did as well.
Oh,
he's done
didn't he?
all sorts, quite a varied.
Loads of, very varied. And I think he came from TV. I think he did a lot of TV over here, but I think Robbery was his first film. And it's well acted. I mean, as with a lot of these films, a lot of these faces you will... I mean, if you're a fan of British cinema... going back, 50 years, there are faces in here you will absolutely recognise. I think George Shule, he's quite a famous face that I knew, but I couldn't quite pinpoint where I'd seen him before. James Booth is a very recognisable face on our screens here, and I didn't actually realise I was reading on IMDb that he was in Twin Peaks. I remember the character. I was like, oh God, yeah, that's him, isn't it? Crazy. Stanley Baker was obviously he also produced this. He was a huge name at the time.
He produced and starred in Zulu as well.
He was in Zulu as well. Yeah.
Unsurprisingly for the time, all male, apart from Joanna Pettit.
Who doesn't have a lot to do here.
No,
really.
No.
She's there to hang off Stanley Baker's arm.
Yeah, get a bit annoyed with him because he won't give up crime.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the weird thing about a lot of these films is that they live well, but it's never enough. And obviously that for him it's not enough. I mean, whether after this it would have been enough.
But they love the thrill, don't they?
Well,
the thrill of the chase and all that.
I mean, it made me think about other crime films and something like Ocean's 11, where everyone is impeccably dressed and drives sports cars. Why are you stealing?
Yeah,
exactly.
I know. Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't look like you have a hard life.
No.
Well, you only really see the personal life of Paul Clifton, don't you? And he obviously lives in a nice house, which I think apparently they filmed it in Stanley Baker's actual house. so he had a nice house. Understandably.
Brings the budget down.
Well, quite, yes. But yeah, you never really see the rest of them. I mean, it's like they bring a few sort of gangs together. So there's all sort of heads of these different groups, where you imagine that the boss man probably does all right for himself, but his minions maybe not so much. But yeah, it does make you wonder in some of these films why they look like they do all right, or they've stolen enough. If they could maybe just live within that, they'd be they wouldn't have to keep committing crimes. But I guess the thrill of it is probably part of it. They can't give up that life.
The big thing in these films, which they don't really play on in this particular film, is trust, and obviously trusting people with, the more men you bring into your job, the less money you're going to get at the end of it, because obviously you've got to give a share to each and every one of them. And I think originally it was going to be 4 of them, but then they realised they needed someone who could drive trains. They needed someone who could stop the train. They needed to have inside men. I think the farmhouse that they held up in, the estate agent obviously had to be in it. So they had to have lots of people in on it. Yeah. I think he was never caught. Obviously the gang becomes bigger and bigger. Yeah. And then of course, you got to have 20 grand, and suddenly £3 million becomes not much.
No, exactly. I mean, Ronnie Biggs, for example, by the time he got to Australia, he hardly had any left. Yeah. I mean, he had paid a lot for plastic surgery and fake documents and things like that. So it's like, he begs the question, what was the point? If by the time you get to, the only reason you're in this country is because you're fleeing from your crime, from arrest. Yeah. And you spent most of the money that you stole getting there. Yeah. What was the point of it?
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows?
Crime does not pay, obviously. Do we have this on?
Yeah. So the reason I chose it is somebody recommended it in a comment quite some time ago. I couldn't find the comment. I thought maybe it was on Money Movers because that's a similar kind of thing. Yep. But again, if you haven't seen that, go and watch it. Obviously, and check that out because that is a great
really
Aussie heist movie from the 70s with Jason Donovan's dad.
Yeah,
but it wasn't on there, and I thought maybe it was on Krull because that was Peter Yates, but the comment wasn't on there, so I couldn't find it. But if you're watching this and you made that comment, thanks, because I spotted the Blu-ray in CEX and grabbed it a few months ago, and it's had a restoration on it. I think the DVD was missing 10 seconds and it was cropped and that, so it wasn't great. Network, who unfortunately have gone under now, they restored it. It's in the correct ratio and all that. So it looks really nice. It's got some extras on it. It's even got a production note booklet in it as well. Cool. And because Network have gone under, it's now out of print. So if I wanted to sell it, I could probably double my money. But I'll keep hold of it now because it was quite good and I might watch it again. Yeah, if you can find a copy, then I would highly recommend it. I mean, it was released in the US by Kino Lorber as well, but on that it's only got a commentary, which isn't on this one, so it's a different extra, obviously, but it doesn't have any of the other stuff. There's interview with Stanley Baker and there's behind the scenes footage and making ofs and all that stuff. So there's quite a lot of stuff in here, and obviously the booklet as well. If you spot a copy of this for a reasonable price, I would grab it because it looks really nice. They did a good job before they went under.
So that was Robbery, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Hit the subscribe button up there, and don't forget to push the bell for notifications. There's other videos to check out either side of us, and join us again soon for another video.